The Way Up to Heaven. Read by Patricia Routledge.
All her life, Mrs. Foster had had an almost pathological fear of missing a train, a plane, a boat, or even a theatre curtain. The mere thought of being late would throw her into a state of nerves. At least half an hour before it was time to leave the house, Mrs. Foster would step out of the elevator all ready to go, and then, being quite unable to sit down, would flutter and fidget from room to room until her husband, who must have been well aware of her state, finally emerged from his privacy and suggested in a cool, dry voice that perhaps they had better get going, had they not. Mr. Eugene Foster, who was nearly 70 years old, lived with his wife in a large house in New York, and they had 4 servants. On this particular morning there was a great deal of bustling about. One maid was distributing bundles of dust sheets, while another was draping them over the furniture. The butler was bringing down suitcases and putting them in the hall. Mrs. Foster herself was thinking of nothing except that she was going to miss her plane if her husband didn't get ready. "What time is it, Walker?" she said to the butler. "It's 10 minutes past 9, madam. And has the car come?" "Yes, madam. I'm just going to put the luggage in now." "It takes an hour to get to Idlewild," she said. "My plane leaves at 11. I shall be late." She began walking up and down the hall. "What time is it, Walker?" "It's 18 minutes past, madam." "Now I really will miss it," she cried. "Oh, I wish he would come." This was an important journey for Mrs. Foster. She was going alone to Paris to visit her daughter, who was married to a Frenchman. Mrs. Foster was fond of her daughter, and she'd developed a great yearning to set eyes on her 3 grandchildren. She knew them only from the many photographs she'd received. Lately she'd come to feel that she didn't wish to live out her days in a place where she couldn't be near these children. She knew that her husband would never leave New York and live in Paris. It was a miracle that he'd agreed to let her fly over there alone for 6 weeks to visit them. "Walker, what time is it?" 22 minutes past, madam." Mr. Foster came into the hall. "Well," he said, "I suppose we'd better get going if you want to catch that plane." "Yes, dear, yes. The car's waiting." "I'll be with you in a moment," he said. "I'm just going to wash my hands." "Walker, will I miss it?" she said. "No, madam," the butler said. "I think you'll make it all right." Mr. Foster appeared again, and the butler helped him with his coat. Mrs. Foster hurried outside. Her husband came after her. He walked down the steps of the house slowly, pausing halfway to observe the sky. "It looks a bit foggy," he said as he sat down beside her in the car. "I shouldn't be surprised if the flight's cancelled." "Don't say that, dear, please." "I arranged everything with the servants," Mr. Foster said. "They're all going off today. I told Walker I'd send him a telegram when we wanted them back." "Yes," she said, "he told me." "I'll move into the club tonight." "Yes, dear. I'll write to you." "I'll call in at the house occasionally to see that everything's all right and to pick up the mail." "Will you write to me?" she asked. "I'll see," he said, "but I doubt it. You know I don't hold with letter writing unless there's something specific to say." They drove on, and as they approached Idlewild, the fog began to thicken and the car had to slow down. "Oh, dear," cried Mrs. Foster, "I'm sure I'm going to miss it now." "Stop fussing," the old man said. "It's bound to be cancelled. I don't know why you bothered to come out." She turned away and peered through the window at the fog. Suddenly the driver stopped the car. "There!" Mr. Foster cried. "We're stuck. I knew it." "No, sir," the driver said. "We made it. This is the airport." Without a word, Mrs. Foster jumped out and hurried through the main entrance. There was a mass of passengers standing around the ticket counters. She pushed her way through and spoke to the clerk. "Yes," he said, "your flight is temporarily postponed. Please don't go away. We're expecting this weather to clear." She went back to her husband and told him the news. "But don't you wait, dear," she said. "I won't," he answered. "Is the luggage out, driver?" "Yes, sir." "Goodbye, dear," Mrs. Foster said. "Goodbye," he answered. "Have a good trip." The car drove off, and Mrs. Foster was left alone. The rest of the day was a nightmare. She sat as close to the airline counter as possible, and every 30 minutes she would get up and ask the clerk if the situation had changed. It wasn't until 6 in the evening that the loudspeakers finally announced that the flight had been postponed until 11 o'clock the next morning. Mrs. Foster didn't know what to do when she heard this news. She would have liked to remain just where she was, but she was already exhausted. So she went to a phone and called the house. Her husband, who was on the point of leaving for the club, answered. She told him the news and asked whether the servants were still there. "They've all gone," he said. "In that case, dear, I'll just get myself a room somewhere for the night." "That would be foolish," he said. "You've got a large house here." "But, dear, there's no food in the house." "Then eat before you come in. Everything you do, you seem to want to make a fuss about it." "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry. I'll get myself a sandwich here." Outside, the fog had cleared a little, but she didn't arrive back at the house until late. Her husband emerged from his study when he heard her coming in. "Well," he said, standing by the study door, "how was Paris?" "We leave at 11 in the morning," she answered. "I've ordered a car for the morning," he said. 9 o'clock. "Oh, thank you. I hope you're not going to bother to come and see me off." "No," he said slowly. "I don't think I will. But there's no reason why you shouldn't drop me at the club on your way." She looked at him. "The club is downtown. It isn't on the way to the airport." "But you'll have plenty of time, my dear. Now I'll see you in the morning at 9. Next morning, Mrs. Foster was up early, and by 8:30 she was downstairs and ready to leave. Shortly after 9, her husband appeared. "If you're going to take me to the club first," he said, "we'd better get going, hadn't we?" "Yes," she cried. "Oh, yes, please." "I'm just going to get a few cigars. I'll be right with you. You get in the car." She turned and went out where the chauffeur was standing. "What time is it?" she asked him. "About 9:15. Mr. Foster came out 5 minutes later. He paused halfway down the steps to examine the sky. "Perhaps she'll be lucky this time," he said as he settled himself beside her in the car. "Hurry, please," she said to the chauffeur. "I'm late." The man started the engine. "Just a moment," Mr. Foster said suddenly. "What is it, dear?" She saw him searching the pockets of his overcoat. "Oh, I had a present I wanted you to take to Ellen," he said. "Now, where on earth is it?" "What sort of present?" "A little box wrapped up in white paper." "A little box, a little box," she cried, and began hunting frantically in the back of the car. Her husband continued searching through the pockets of his coat. "Confound it," he said. "I must have left it in my bedroom. I won't be a moment." "Oh, please," she cried. "We haven't got time. It's only one of those silly combs anyway. You're always giving her combs." "And what's wrong with combs, may I ask?" "Nothing, dear, but—" "Stay here," he commanded. "I'm going to get it." "Oh, please be quick." She sat still, waiting and waiting. "Chauffeur, what time is it?" "Nearly 9:30. At this point, Mrs. Foster suddenly spotted something white in the crack of the seat where her husband had been sitting. She reached over and pulled out a small paper-wrapped box, and she couldn't help noticing that it was wedged down, as though with the help of a pushing hand. "Here it is!" she cried. "I've found it!" She hurried out of the car and up the steps to the front door. She slid the key into the keyhole and was about to turn it, and then stopped. Her head came up, and she stood there absolutely motionless, her whole body arrested right in the middle of all this hurry to turn the key and get into the house, and she waited. It seemed as though she was listening for the repetition of some sound that she'd heard a moment before from a place far away inside the house. She remained in that position, about to enter, but not entering, trying instead to hear and to analyze the sounds. Then all at once she sprang to life again. She withdrew the key from the door and came running back down the steps. "It's too late!" she cried to the chauffeur. "I can't wait for him! Hurry now! To the airport!" Her face had turned absolutely white, and her whole expression had suddenly altered. A peculiar hardness had settled itself upon the features. "Isn't your husband travelling with you?" the man asked. "Certainly not. I was only going to drop him at the club. He'll get a cab. Don't sit there talking. I've got a plane to catch." Mrs. Foster caught her plane with a few minutes to spare, and as the plane flew farther away from New York, a great sense of calmness began to settle upon her. By the time she reached Paris, she was as cool and calm as she could wish. She met her grandchildren, and every day she took them for walks and told them stories. Once a week she wrote a letter to her husband, a nice, chatty letter, full of news and gossip, which always ended with the words, "Be sure to take your meals regularly, although this is something I'm afraid you may not be doing when I'm not with you." When the 6 weeks were up, everybody was sad that she had to return to America. Everybody, that is, except her. Surprisingly, she didn't seem to mind. Exactly 6 weeks after she had arrived, she sent a cable to her husband and caught the plane back to New York. Arriving at Idlewild, Mrs. Foster was interested to observe that there was no car to meet her, but she was extremely calm and did not overtip the porter who helped her into a taxi. New York was colder than Paris, and there were lumps of dirty snow lying in the gutters. The taxi drew up before the house, and Mrs. Foster rang the bell. But there was no answer. She rang again, but still no one came. She took out her key and opened the door. The first thing she saw as she entered was a great pile of mail lying on the floor. The place was dark, and there was a curious odour in the air. She walked quickly across the hall and disappeared around the corner to the left. There was something purposeful about this action. She had the air of a woman who is off to investigate a rumour or to confirm a suspicion. And when she returned a few seconds later, there was a glimmer of satisfaction on her face. She paused in the centre of the hall. Then suddenly she turned and went to her husband's study. She found his address book, and after hunting through it, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Hello," she said. "This is 9 East 62nd Street. Could you send someone round as soon as possible, do you think?" "Yes. It seems to be stuck between the 2nd and 3rd floors. Thank you so much. Goodbye." She replaced the receiver and sat there at her husband's desk, patiently waiting for the man who would be coming soon to repair the lift.